Tim Linder here. Let's talk about the crop tool inside of Photoshop. So if you go down, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tools down, you've got the crop tool. Click and hold, and there's other tools underneath, which we'll get to a little bit later, specifically the slice and slice select tool that really deal with more moving images out to the web. But let's talk about the crop tool up here at the top. First of all, you'll notice that there's an option bar up here at the top. And you also notice that there's some little brackets that show up around your image. One of the most important things when using the crop tool that you want to look at is whether or not you're going to delete the crop pixels. And what does that mean? Also, this content aware checkbox is important as well. So if I choose this delete cropped pixels checkbox here, and I were to crop my image, let's say that I want to get a tighter, more portrait-oriented crop of just this bird and put him in the center there, I'll notice that I can move my crop tool and I can visualize what I'm eliminating from this image. I can also change how that visual works too. Right now it's a 70% opacity, but if I move that down or up, you'll see that it gets brighter or darker. So this is just visualizing what I'm going to be removing and what I'm going to be changing from the crop. So this is just kind of options for your crop tool here in this little gear icon. You've also got these little rule of thirds and diagonal and grid and triangle, those sort of things. And they're just really ways in which you can crop in order to maybe make your image a little bit more visually interesting. Give yourself some guides to do that. I'll discuss that maybe in another video, but they're just kind of guides that you can change. But again, more importantly is this delete crop pixels. Now, when I'm finished with this crop, if I'm happy with where things are, I could move this around. If I'm happy with where it is, I can hit the checkbox and finish, or I could double click on the inside, or I can hit the return key on the keyboard, all of which crop my image. And I noticed over here in my layers panel, I've got a locked background layer, and this image is cropped. And if I were to go to File, Save As, I've got the option of a JPEG or all these different options and things like that. I can save my image. If I try to choose my move tool here and I click and I want to move this image and maybe I want to shift it over a little bit, it gives me an error, convert to normal layer. Okay, I'll convert it to a normal layer. Let's see what happens. Converted to a normal layer, it shifted and moved it, and it changed my layer from a locked background layer to this layer 0 is what it calls it now. Now I'm able to move this around, and you'll notice that the portions of the image that I moved are gone now, and I've got this black and white checker box here that designates that there's transparency. And if I were to try and save this here at this point here or here, File, Save As, now that I've kind of converted this layer to a normal layer, it's not a locked background anymore, I could choose Save As, and I notice now I don't have really the option for a regular JPEG anymore because it doesn't support transparency. JPEG doesn't support transparency. So I have to save as a Photoshop or one of these other ones. I could force it to save as a JPEG if I choose Save as Copy and then it saves it as a different version. I'm going to have to change the file name. It's just Photoshop's way of kind of forcing you so that you if you've got something that can only be allowed in a certain format like Photoshop or a PNG can support transparency, it forces you to save as a copy because you might eliminate that ability to access that kind of file if you change it. So that's one of the things that happens if you change your layer from a locked background to something that supports transparency, but you can't necessarily save as a JPEG anymore. Okay, so I'm going to undo that. Command Z, back to my original, or I could always choose File Revert because I haven't saved anything, or revert back to my originally saved version. So let's try this again. I'll go to crop, and this time I'm not going to delete the cropped pixels, okay? And I'm going to scoot this bird over here, and I'm going to crop this here, and I'm going to double click or hit the checkbox and complete my crop, and I notice, oh, it automatically this time changed it to layer 0. Same issue with File, Save As. I don't get the JPEG version, although I could choose Save Copy. But one of the things that this has got, since I didn't delete the crop pixels, if I get my move tool, notice I could shift it from side to side and all that information is still really there. I don't immediately go to transparency. All those pixels that I moved were cropped out. Were not necessarily cropped out, they're just hidden in this file there. So that's what delete crop pixels means. It might delete those crop pixels. I can always go back and flatten this image if I want to and hit this little fly out menu, and you don't see it because I'm kind of outside the bounds here, but I could choose flatten image and it would change that back to a locked background layer, and I could save as JPEG or save as copy. But anyway, that is the difference between delete crop pixels and don't delete crop pixels. I'm going to undo that one more too, a couple times, undo that a couple times. So I've got this crop tool. Now, another really important thing that you can do with the crop tool, which we'll really discuss a lot more when we talk about resolution and pixel dimension in a raster image. As I zoom in here, the smallest element of this image is a pixel, and the more pixels that you have in this image, the more pixel dimension, the more kind of resolution that you might have, or the larger you might be able to print it without being able to break down and kind of see these pixels happen, right? So what you can do with the crop tool is you can also designate how many pixels you want, or resolution, or the size. So I can lock it into specific things. I can pick from specific sizes if I want. Let's say I want a 8.5 by 11 image. I could choose that, and now it forces me, if I were to crop this to 8.5 by 11, anything that I crop is going to be 8.5 by 11 or 11 by 8.5 if I kind of scoot over here. I could also go to the edge and rotate. I can get a rotated crop if I want to, and crop this bird this way. If I wanted to get a 8.5 by 11 that looked like that, double click. Now I've got an 8.5 by 11 file with 300 pixels per inch document. So if I were to look at my crop tool again, that's what 8.5 by 11, 300 pixels per inch. I could enter in whatever values I want. If somebody says, hey Tim, I need to get a banner ad, and the image that I need for that banner ad is 1920 pixels wide by, I don't know, 200 pixels tall. I could go up here and enter in my own values with height and resolution. So I could say, what did I say? 1920 pixels. I'm going to make sure I add px for pixels, not inches anymore. I don't want 1900 inches. That'd be a huge file. And then I'm going to do, what did I say? 200 pixels wide. I'm going to create this kind of banner ad, right? And so let's say I'm going to crop it, and I wanted to crop something here where I go back to my bird, and maybe he's down in here. I can kind of see his head on this side. And maybe I want some sort of a banner ad where I had something like that. And a double click. And now I have a 1920 by 200 pixel wide image. So I could enter whatever values I want in here. And if I don't delete the crop pixels, I can always revert back to my original version. I could move my crop tool out. I think there's probably also a way if I option click, or where is it here? Thought there was a way that I could go, oh, clear my crop. No, maybe I already cropped, so I can't clear it back to the original. But I could always go back in and stretch my crop. So if I'm not deleting my pixels, I can always go back and get my original back if I wanted to. I haven't deleted that, right? So that is part of the cropping. Now I'm going to go to File, Revert. I haven't saved this. I'm going to jump back to my original version and a couple other things that I want to show you. So if I get my crop tool, not to mention I can enter in different values, but over here I could say, let's do content aware. Within Photoshop now, you can choose for it to come up with some different things. So if I don't have content aware chosen and I make my image larger than what it was before, I get this sort of version of a crop where I introduce some transparency. If I choose content aware crop, and I go in here and I add a little bit to the top of my image and I double click, Photoshop is going to fill this in with whatever it thinks should be there, and it does a really nice job. If you go too far, it's going to have difficulty trying to figure out what's there sometimes. Okay. But, you know, it kind of looks a little bit computer generated. And this works well on things that are organic, like, you know, this branch and clouds and skies and bushes and those sort of things. But if you were to go through and try to crop something like this and say, oh, let's go ahead and do content aware crop on the end and see if it could come up with this 50s car and see what it looks like, content aware fill, crop it, trying to figure it out, and yeah, it doesn't really work that well, right? So more organic sort of things work well if you've got Photoshop's going to make things up on the end, right? Or create things that weren't initially there. Another thing that you can do with a different type of crop tool, there's another way that I'll show you later that I like to do better to actually align, but there's some things with my perspective crop tool here that I could come in and say, all right, if I had something like this, I could crop and I could move these angles in here, and I could crop this and crop this into a perspective to maybe make this more like a square if I wanted to, and crop that as a little shift was off there a little bit. But you can see how that works. I don't oftentimes use that. I'll show you a different way a little bit later in another video. But that is the basics of the crop tool inside of Photoshop.